Part 3. After. The Sand Island Express, Saturday, December 13th, 1941. I gripped the side walls of the Navy launch with my old nervousness as we motored across Pearl Harbor. There were 4 of us in the boat, me, the pilot, and the 2 Navy guys headed for Honolulu. It was almost a week after the attack, but it felt like a lifetime ago that Stanley and I had crossed this same stretch of water on our way back from baseball practice. Pearl Harbor was completely different now. The air smelled of hot metal and black smoke and charred skin. Oil oozed from dozens of damaged ships, and burning slicks of the stuff moved down the water with the tide, ghostly and dangerous. Half the Pacific's fleet was hull down or belly up. The Arizona had only stopped burning a few days ago, and the rescue crews were still working night and day to cut people out of the Oklahoma. Tugboats and repair ships hovered around the other ships in the harbor, helping them stay afloat. And everywhere, there were bodies. Still. It was unbelievable. I averted my eyes from the captain's gigs and divers who trolled the water all around us, afraid I'd watch them pull another dead sailor from the deep. America's indomitable fortress had turned out to be anything but. An airplane droned overhead, and all of us in the launch ducked. The ships that were still afloat had sailors on the round-the-clock guard duty, and I watched now as every one of those sailors aimed their rifles at the sky. It was just an American plane, though, and they let it fly by. The night after the attack, American pilots hadn't been so lucky. Frightened, itchy-fingered sailors had shot down 6 of our own planes, thinking it was another air assault. My dad's plane hadn't been one of them, thankfully. Not that we knew that night. Mom and Ginny and I had no idea if Dad was alive or dead until 48 hours later, when he came staggering into our temporary quarters on the mainland, grimy and miserable and ready to pass out. He told us that he'd shot down 2 Zeros during the attack, and then spent the next 2 days flying nonstop patrols to look for the retreating Japanese planes without any luck. Except for a few random strikes on the way out, the attack on Pearl Harbor had ended for good after the second wave, and we didn't understand why, but the invasion everybody expected never happened. The Japanese army had just wrecked the U.S. Pacific Fleet and run. But they had done plenty enough damage, and it had officially dragged the United States into a war. As the boat sailed on across the harbor, I thought back to the day after the attack. It had been lunchtime in Hawaii and nighttime in Washington, D.C. Mom, Jeannie, and I, along with all other relocated families, had huddled around a radio, just like every other person in the whole country, to hear President Roosevelt's address to Congress. He called December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, and asked Congress to formally declare war on Japan. They did. A few days later, Germany declared war on the U.S., and Italy followed. Now, everybody in America was all in on the war. Webb Edwards said on the radio that people were lined up at Army and Navy recruiting stations across. Even people who'd been against the war before agreed. We had to fight. And I was with them. I hadn't wanted to fight. I hadn't wanted to come to this. But Mr. Summers was right. You couldn't get punched in the face and not do something. There was more to it, though. On the night after the attack, as I huddled sleepless with Mom and Ginny, listening to overzealous air raid sirens, I had remembered something Stanley had said on our way to the Utah early that morning. How real heroes step up when they see other people getting hurt. I was starting to think that maybe the United States shouldn't have had to get punched in the face to fight in the war. That maybe seeing our allies attacked should have been enough. "Check it out," one of the sailors in the launch said, startling me out of my thoughts. He slapped his buddy on the shoulder and pointed to a barge being towed by a tug in the opposite direction. The flat barge was packed full of Japanese Americans, mostly men, but some women, sitting on row after row of simple wooden benches. They all looked tired and dejected, and to a person, they kept their heads down and their eyes on their feet. Probably because standing over them were guards with guns. The soldiers were white and thin in their new, oversized uniforms, each of them nearly as young as I was. The guards looked scared and angry and pointed their rifles and bayonets and submachine guns right at the heads of their prisoners. I sucked in a quick, frightened breath. It looked like young guards were itching for any excuse to shoot, as payback for the destruction all around us. "The Sand Island Express," said the sailor who'd pointed, and suddenly I understood. Right after the attack, the Army started rounding up recent Japanese immigrants to Hawaii to intern them on Sand Island at the entrance to Honolulu Harbor. Then, 3 days ago, the Army began arresting Japanese Americans who were teachers, newspaper editors, business people, and community leaders, regardless of how long their families had been here. Stanley's grandmother had even been arrested because she taught at a Japanese school. The military government called the people they arrested prisoners of war, but as far as I knew, they hadn't done anything but have Japanese ancestry. God, I don't think I could do that, said the sailor's friend, and I felt a spark of gratitude for him speaking up in defense of the prisoners. Me, I just want to shoot every Jap on sight, he added. And that spark was quickly snuffed out. Ought to round up all of them and kick them out of Hawaii, said the first sailor. Send them back to where they came from. This is where they come from, I said, startling the sailors. If you kicked every Japanese American out of Hawaii, there wouldn't be enough people left to keep things running. The sailors shifted in their seats and frowned at me like I was a traitor. I didn't care. Stanley said he wanted to pick his own fights, but he wasn't here, which meant it was up to me to speak up and say something. That's where I was heading now, to see Stanley. It felt like an ocean had opened up between us since the attack. Part of it was that we simply never saw each other anymore. School had been canceled, maybe forever. So had baseball and everything else that didn't have to do with the war. Mom and Ginny and I still lived on the base, but not on Ford Island. We were in temporary quarters near the hospital, where Mom and Ginny now volunteered as nurses. Stanley and his mom, meanwhile, had moved in with relatives in Honolulu. They never visited the base, even though Mr. Summers practically lived at the airfield, just like my dad did. The other part of it, of course, was how differently Stanley and his mom and all the other Japanese Americans in Hawaii had been treated after the attack. The sailors glared at me as I climbed out of the launch in Honolulu. I did my best to ignore them. I didn't have time for more nonsense. Mom and Ginny and I were leaving Hawaii any day now. I'd just been to the airfield on Ford Island to see my dad in case we had to leave in the night. Now, I had to find Stanley before I missed my chance to tell him goodbye. The VVV. I found Stanley right where his mother told me he'd be, shoveling dirt on a hillside, and he wasn't alone. A small group of young Japanese-American men were working right alongside him. They were all members of the VVV, the Varsity Victory Volunteers. A few of the VVV had been sailors before the attack, but almost the next day, the Navy had kicked them out because they were Japanese. Those sailors and a bunch of Japanese-American college kids started the VVV to do their part. The government wouldn't let the volunteer Japanese-American unit have guns or uniforms, so they kept busy building temporary shelters, patching roads, and clearing debris. And digging graves. The VVV at the cemetery had shed their shirts, their backs glistening in the hot Hawaiian sun. Stanley was among the youngest of them, but he was working twice as hard, shoveling dirt down at the bottom of a grave like he was digging for buried treasure. A shovelful of soil hit my canvas shoes, and I pretended to complain. "Hey, I'm walking here." Stanley looked up at me, and for a second, I saw happiness fill his face. His smile shrank back to a thin line a second later. "Hey," he said, "what are you doing here?" "Came to see you," I told him. "Can you take a break?" One of the older boys nodded at Stanley and I gave him a hand crawling out of the grave. We walked a little way off to a pile of canteens, and I looked out at the view while Stanley took a long, thirsty drink. Down the hill, I could see the famous green Punch Bowl crater, and beneath that, the city of Honolulu, Sand Island, and the crystal blue ocean. I looked away from Sand Island and everything it had come to stand for, toward Pearl Harbor to the west. I realized with a start that this was the first time I'd been off the base since before the attack. "I think I can see my house from here," I said. "My temporary one, at least. That puts us near the base hospital." Stanley nodded, still trying to catch his breath. We watched together as an American fighter plane flew along the coastline, bound for Pearl Harbor's airfields. With a piercing screech of a Raptor, the P-40 Warhawk hurtles across the harbor in furious pursuit of its pitiless prey, I said, mimicking Stanley's comic book voice. "Huh, yeah," Stanley chuckled, but I could tell his heart wasn't in it. He spoke again without looking at me. "Thought you might be gone to California already. The day after the attack, Admiral Nimitz had announced that the families of American servicemen at Pearl Harbor would be shipped back to California, where we would be safe. Or safer. We couldn't leave right away, though. With half their fleet at the bottom of the harbor, the Navy had to figure out how they were going to evacuate hundreds of women and children. And even then, they couldn't tell us when we'd be leaving. Otherwise, Japanese spies could find out and have 100 submarines waiting to torpedo us the second we left Hawaii. But not all of us were leaving. "I'm sorry I'm going," I told Stanley. "And I'm sorry you're not coming with us." "Me too," said Stanley. "But you know we can't. They took my grandmother to Sand Island, but my cousin in California, they took his house and his dad's grocery store and sent his whole family to a detention center in Arizona. If we go to the States, Mom and I will end up in one of those camps with them, even with Dad in the Navy." I couldn't imagine things being worse than they were here. Besides, the detentions on Sand Island, the military had taken away Japanese Americans' cars and boats, removed the shortwave receivers from their radios, and closed down all the Japanese schools, clubs, and societies. Japanese language newspapers had been censored, and Japanese Americans were told that if they spoke Japanese on the phone, their calls would be disconnected by the operator. Stanley and I turned away from the view and walked down a row of fresh graves. Each one was decorated with a white cross and a pot of red poinsettias. It looked like they were decorated for Christmas, which was a few days away. It was hard to remember it was the holiday season, or to care. "Have you heard some of the things people are saying?" Stanley asked. "There's a stupid rumor that one of the Japanese pilots who got shot down was wearing a McKinley high school class ring. And somebody else said that AJAs had carved arrows into their fields, pointing the way to Pearl Harbor for the planes." "AJAs?" I asked. "Americans of Japanese ancestry," Stanley explained. "Some of the older guys in the VVV, they're saying that now instead of Japanese American, to remind everybody that we're Americans first, Japanese second." He paused. "Which feels ridiculous that we would have to do that at all. Off the base, there's more of us in Hawaii than there were of you. More Japanese people, more Chinese people, more Pacific Islanders. And we're all Americans, real Americans, whether we were born here or moved here." "I know," I said. Stanley sighed. "Sorry, it's just, I never had to think about how American I was," he said sadly. "Not until now." We were both quiet for a little while as we walked on. The air smelled like ferns and salt water and flower blossoms, like Pearl Harbor before the attack. "You ever think about our comic book? About the arsenal?" I asked Stanley. Stanley shook his head. "Not really," he said. "How about you?" "I haven't been able to write since the attack," I told him. "And I lost all my old stories when my house was destroyed. Were you able to save any drawings from your home?" "Some," said Stanley. "But stuff like that doesn't seem to matter anymore." "Yeah," I said quietly. "And it used to mean everything. To me, at least." Stanley nodded without looking at me. "It used to for me, too," he said. "Working on stories with you was the best. And I really believed it, that we could publish our own comic one day." "We still can," I told him. I sounded desperate, and I was. I wanted this. I needed it. I'd never felt more alive than when Stanley and I were making comics together. Now, I just felt numb inside. Stanley stared into the distance. "When I was in first grade, my art teacher told me I was good at drawing," he said. "Told me I could grow up to be an artist. That one little comment planted a seed in me. And ever since then, I practiced and practiced. And I got pretty good." "Really good," I told him. "You can be a professional artist, Stanley, a great one." Stanley shook his head. "I thought I could. For a long time. But I see now that I've been living in this bubble, like Mom said. Like Namor and Atlantis. Everybody under the ocean, they were good with him being half Atlantean. But when he went to the surface world, they saw him as an enemy. Just like me, living in this perfect Hawaiian bubble where nobody cared what I looked like. I didn't realize until the attack that most of America doesn't see me as American." Stanley kicked the head of his shovel with his toes. "Now I get why Namor is always so angry all the time and wants to tear everything down. Nobody's going to let somebody who looks like me draw comic books in America. Not now. Not ever." "That's not true," I told Stanley. "The world's at war with Germany, too. And nobody seems to feel that way about German Americans. I mean, Admiral Nimitz's family is from Germany. Stanley scoffed. It's different for people who look like you, he said. Different for Haoles. Haoles, the Hawaiian word for non-natives, outsiders, white people. Stanley was right, I realized. German and Japanese bad guys had been all over comic books long before we were at war with either country. Captain America had been punching out Hitler on the covers of his comics for more than a year now. The German bad guys in comics were buffoons. They talked like Zeus and had ridiculously cartoonish bodies. But that was nothing compared to how Japanese villains were drawn. Japanese characters spoke in childlike, broken English and had ugly faces and fangs for teeth. They were more monster than human. Now that I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. How had I read all those comics and been fine with them? I couldn't imagine the way Stanley must have felt all those times he'd read the same comics, seeing people who were supposed to look like him drawn like ogres. Maybe Stanley was right. Maybe people who accepted human beings drawn to be like monsters would never accept somebody like him drawing superheroes. Stanley gasped quietly, and I stopped. What is it? I asked. And then I saw where we were. The future. Without meaning to, we had ended up at Brooks Leonard's freshly dug grave. There was no stone yet, but Jenny had picked out a good spot for him under a willow tree. His baseball bat was laid out lengthwise in the dirt. Stanley and I stood wordlessly by the grave. In my head, I told Brooks that I was sorry and that I missed him. After a moment, Stanley turned away. You don't have to do this, I told Stanley. Dig graves with the VVV like you're trying to atone for the attack or something. It's not your fault. Just like it's not your fault that Brooks died? That's different, I said. I still blamed myself for Brooks's death. I always would. But Stanley was right. Brooks might have been killed 100 different ways that day, even if I had acted differently. And that was the one thing the attack on Pearl Harbor had taught me for sure, that the only thing I could control was my own actions. Stanley gave me a playful frown, and I relented. Okay, fine. It's neither of our faults. Stanley smirked. I know, and I'm not trying to make up for anything. It's that way for some of the guys here, but that's not why I'm doing it, he said. I'm digging graves to honor all these American sailors who died. Americans like me. I mean, one of them could have been my dad, or yours, Stanley added. I'm burying heroes. I nodded. I knew Stanley well enough to know what he was saying was true, and to still worry that wasn't the only reason. But I had said my piece. I stood beside Stanley as he looked back over Honolulu and Pearl Harbor and across the sea, as if he was looking all the way to Japan. Frank, are you still scared? Stanley asked. I laughed softly. Yes, I said, all the time. I am too, said Stanley. Didn't used to be, but I am now. I'm scared about the future. Well, I said, take it from somebody with a lot of experience with fear. It's not the being scared that matters. That's only human. It's what you do when you're scared that counts. Stanley's eyes finally broke away from the horizon. I should get back to it, he said. And I should get home, in case they call and say it's time to go. Hope I see you again before we leave, I told him. Yeah. I may not know until you're gone, though, said Stanley. Japanese spies and all. Yeah, I said. Stanley held out a dirty, blistered hand, and we shook on it. It felt formal. And final. Limbo. After seeing Stanley, I went back to the cinder block barracks on the base where my family and I live now. The barracks felt a little like the dungeon under Admiral Bellinger's house, I thought as I stepped inside, or a prison. But it didn't matter. None of it mattered. My family wasn't going to be here very long. Our suitcases were already packed and standing by the door, ready for when we got the call to evacuate. The room that Janie and I shared had 2 beds, an electric clock that buzzed on the wall, and a small desk with a metal lamp and a phone. The walls were painted white on the top and military green on the bottom, and a grimy window with hexagonal wires on the glass let in fuzzy brown light. Mom and Ginny were still busy volunteering at the hospital, so I was the only one there. I stood in my room and looked at the line in the wall where the green and the white paint came together. The line was perfectly horizontal, except for one tiny spot in the middle of it, right above my head. For some reason, the painters had left a little divot on the green there, a tiny notch of white that dipped down and broke the otherwise flawless line. All that hard work, and that one little mistake had ruined it. I blinked and shook my head. What was I doing? How long had I been standing there staring at the wall? I pinched the bridge of my nose and closed my eyes. This waiting, this limbo, was making me loopy. I should write, I told myself. That always grounded me, made me feel like I was doing something good, something useful. I went to my suitcase and pulled out my notebook and a pencil, took them to the desk, sat down, turned on the light, turned it off again, opened up a notebook. At the top of the first empty page, I wrote, The Arsenal, Issue 1. Underneath that, I wrote, Page 1, Panel 1, The Arsenal. The Arsenal does what? Sits, stands, runs, is trapped, is punched, is laughing, is crying. What was the Arsenal doing? Who was he? What was he afraid of? What were his powers? Why did he fight? What was his origin story? I sat ready, pencil poised over the line in my notebook, and waited for the story to come to me. And waited. And waited. But nothing came. No ideas for powers, no dialogue, no origin story. Maybe it was the war. Maybe it was the waiting to leave. Maybe it was not having Stanley there to talk through ideas. A lot of it was not having Stanley there. That was when the real magic had happened. But what was the point anyway? Who cared about comics anymore? Or books, or music, or sports, or movies, or Christmas? And even if I did write something, who was going to draw it? Not Stanley. He was too busy digging graves. We all had bigger things to worry about now. As I closed my notebook, I thought about the shape of stories. How right toward the end, there was always a moment when it felt like the heroes couldn't win, no matter what they did. In a comic book, that was the moment when the heroes dug down deep inside and found that extra little something that put them over the top against the big bad guy and let them save the day. On the day of the attack, getting Kowalczyk, Joseph H., and Patrick to the hospital, it felt like a victory. Like Stanley and I were the heroes. But now, I couldn't help but fear that Stanley and we'd never had a chance to win. Like we'd lost more than we'd gained. Stanley had lost the belief that he was just like everybody else, that he could grow up and do anything, be anything he wanted. Me, I'd lost that giddy, joyful feeling of creating something, of writing words and seeing them come to life as drawings and sharing them with other people. And most of all, I'd lost my best friend. Aloha, Saturday, December 20th, 1941. They came for us in the night, American servicemen knocking quietly on our door at 4 a.m. and telling me and Mom and Ginny that it was time to leave Hawaii. It was just before sunrise now, and still dark out as I stood on the dock, bleary-eyed and wobbly, in line to board our ship. Hundreds of women and children waiting with us, carrying everything they owned. I saw Arthur and Maxine standing with their mom, Mrs. Harding with her ukulele case, the Dawsons, Charlie Moore and his little sister and their mom. I looked away. Mom and Ginny and I carried small suitcases with borrowed clothes, and not much else, except for Brooks's baseball glove, which Ginny carried under her arm. I saw her touch it gently when she thought no one was looking. She was leaving him behind now for good. We both were. I thought back to the start of the attack, when Stanley and I had been sliding down the hull of the Utah on our behinds. I'd wanted to be somewhere else then, somewhere safe, like California. But now that we were actually heading to California, I didn't want to go. I didn't want to leave my dad. I didn't want to leave Hawaii, where I'd been so happy. I didn't want to leave Stanley. Maybe I was realizing there were some things that were worth sacrificing a little safety for. A nervous restlessness buzzed through the crowd. Of the 100 ways we could die on a 5-day ocean voyage to California, an attack by a Japanese sub was number 1 on the list. The Pacific Ocean was crawling with them now that we were officially at war. So, while everyone was anxious, we were quiet too. We were military families, after all. We'd been trained as well as our servicemen. I stood on my tiptoes, looking for Stanley. I could see a long way in the crowds, thanks to how tall I was. But I didn't see him. We hadn't talked since I'd gone to the cemetery a week ago, and I didn't want that handshake to be our final goodbye. I planned to call Stanley from the barracks and tell him we were leaving, but the soldier who'd woken us up had stood watch over us and gathered our things. A phone call, let alone one to an American of Japanese ancestry, was most definitely not allowed. But Honolulu was a small place, and I hoped the island grapevine would get word to him that we were leaving. Ginny saw me searching the crowd. "He'll come," she told me quietly. "They always come, because they know this is goodbye forever." I wasn't sure whether to find that reassuring or depressing. Of course, Ginny would think that Stanley and I would never talk again. That's what had happened with her and the girl back in Florida she thought had been her forever best friend. Things were going to be different for me and Stanley, I decided. I had a plan to make it happen, but it was only going to work if Stanley showed up. A line of ambulances appeared, their lights and sirens off so as not to alert any spies. Inside, we all knew, were the soldiers and sailors too injured to stay in Hawaii. They would be accompanying us back to California for better care and recovery. The waiting passengers parted silently and respectfully as stretcher crews carried the wounded men up the ramp to the ship. "Wait, one of the wounded men said as a stretcher was passing me, and the orderlies came to a stop. The sailor on the stretcher reached out and grabbed my arm, and I jumped. Then I saw who it was, and I smiled with relief. "Joe," I said softly. It was Kowalczyk Joseph H., the sailor Stanley and I had ferried from Ford Island to Hospital Point. "Hey, kid, you coming along on this pleasure cruise too?" Joe asked, and I nodded. "That's great," he said. "Come visit me in the sick bay between watching out for subs." "I will," I told him. Every day after the attack, I'd gone to the hospital to check on our wounded sailor. He'd been in a coma at first, and there were some days when I couldn't see him because he was in surgery. But after 5 days, he was awake and talking in his hospital bed. That's when I'd found out he liked for people to call him Joe. "Hey, maybe I'll get to meet your buddy. Tell him to come by too," Joe said, not realizing that Stanley wasn't coming with us. I would have to explain it to him later. "I owe you guys my life," Joe said as the orderlies got underway again. "I mean it." "Thanks, Joe," I said, enjoying the glow of being a hero again, if only for a moment. "I'll see you on the ship." My mom hugged me. She knew the whole story of me and Stanley on the motorboat now. "I'm proud of you, Frank," she whispered. "But don't ever do anything like that again." I smiled. I was pleased that she was proud of me, and that she thought I might actually do something dangerous again. When the last of the wounded sailors had taken aboard, it was our turn to climb the ramp up to the ship. But Stanley still hadn't shown. He had to have heard we were leaving. Unless he didn't care anymore. But even as I thought it, I couldn't believe it. Despite everything that was pulling us apart, we both knew what we were about to lose. Mom and Ginny and I moved slowly up the ramp. I used my increasingly higher vantage point to search the docks for Stanley, stopping every couple of feet to stand up on my toes. The lady behind me groused for me to get a move on, but I didn't care. I was halfway up to the ship when... Wait, was that? Yes, it was Stanley, running to the end of the line and searching frantically for me. "Stanley, up here!" I yelled, immediately getting shushed by a dozen moms. I waved until he saw me, and he hopped up and down and waved back. I signaled for him to wait there and started to push my way back down the ramp. Sorry, I whispered as I went against the tide. The other passengers scowled and grumbled, but they let me by. I pushed through the crowd and hurried to where I'd seen Stanley. When I finally spotted him close, he looked like he just climbed out of bed and thrown on the first clothes he'd found on the floor, which was probably exactly what he'd done. I dropped my suitcase on the ground, and we stood awkwardly for a second, trying to figure out how to greet each other. A handshake? We'd already done that. A hug? Too embarrassing. We settled for just smiling and raising our chins at each other instead. "Hey," I said, "I didn't think you were going to make it." "I couldn't leave the house until after the curfew ended," Stanley said, slightly out of breath. Right, I should have remembered. With the U.S. military now in control of all of Hawaii, there were strict punishments for leaving your house at night, especially for AJAs. I glanced back over my shoulder. Mom and Ginny were already on board the ship, and the line was moving. I didn't have long. "I hate that I'm leaving," I said. And I meant it. As dangerous as it was to stay in Hawaii, the possibility of never talking to Stanley again was worse. "You'll write, won't you?" we both asked at the same time, which made us laugh. "Of course I'll write," I told Stanley. "But you have to write too. In fact, I know what your first letter can be." I pulled out a small stack of folded-up papers from my back pocket. I held them up for a second, still not sure, but finally decided to go for it. "Here," I said, thrusting the papers into Stanley's hands. Stanley opened the pages and read the title aloud. "The Sleeping Giant Awakens? Wait, is this?" I nodded. "The script for the first issue of our Arsenal of Democracy comic," I told him. "I mean, it's still rough, and it needs a lot of work, but—" "Is this his origin story?" Stanley asked, turning the pages. "Yeah, I figured out the perfect power for him to have," I said. "You'll see when you read it." "Hang on," said Stanley. "The way you've described the Arsenal here, you kept him Japanese-American." "An American of Japanese ancestry," I said. Stanley frowned. "Frank, we can't do this," he said, pushing the script back into my hands. "Nobody wants this. Nobody will publish this. The main character looks like the enemy." Even now, I could feel people's eyes on me and Stanley. Him, because he looked Japanese, and me, because I was talking to him. "No," I said. "The Arsenal looks like you. He looks like an American." Stanley shook his head. "Will you at least try to draw it?" I asked. "I don't know," said Stanley. "I thought you said you couldn't write anymore." "I couldn't for a while," I said. "But a friend told me a real hero always fights for what's right." Stanley raised his eyebrows. "So making comics makes us heroes now?" "Maybe," I said. I huffed. The line to the boat was moving, and I didn't know exactly how to say what I was feeling. "Maybe when it feels like the world is ending and nobody cares, somebody who makes comics, who makes anything creative, is a kind of hero. Because we need stories and pictures and stuff." Stanley still looked doubtful, but I could see that he was thinking about it. A crewman blew a handheld whistle, and I jumped. I guessed it was a stand-in for the ship's whistle, which would have been loud enough that Emperor Hirohito himself back in Japan would know that our ship was ready to leave Pearl Harbor. "I have to go," I told Stanley. I pushed the script back to him. "Draw the comic, will you?" I asked. "Draw it and send it back to me when you're done. And then, when the war's over, we can start our own comic book company, with me writing and you drawing the pictures." Stanley laughed reluctantly. "Maybe," he said. "I don't know. We'll see." The whistle blew again. I raised a hand. "Aloha, Stanley," I said. Hawaiians use the word aloha, like hello or goodbye, but it actually meant something like love and friendship and peace. I meant all those things when I said it to Stanley. He was my best friend, and I loved him like a brother, and I hoped he found peace. "Aloha, Frank," Stanley said, returning the wave as I ran for the ship. I was the last one on board as the sailor shut the gate. Ginny and Mom were waiting for me along the crowded rail, and I let Ginny give me a long hug. She understood what I was leaving behind more than most. She'd done it before, and she was doing it again. As the ship slipped its moorings and pulled away from the dock, I thought again about origin stories. Here in Hawaii, I'd rewritten mine. Become the real McCoy. The one who was still nervous and scared, but not so much that I wouldn't stand up for what was right. But I didn't want the attack on Pearl Harbor to be Stanley's origin story. I didn't want it to be the event that defined his life. I hoped Stanley's origin story was still that moment when a teacher told a young American of Japanese ancestry that he could grow up to be an artist. I found Stanley in the crowd of people still on the dock, and we waved to each other one last time. We'd been a dynamic duo, I realized, and the war, like some comic book supervillain, was threatening to destroy the creative world we'd built together. But maybe, just maybe, the Arsenal of Democracy was the superhero who would save it. And the book ends here with the actual comic book that presumably these characters created. So it's called The Arsenal of Democracy. I'm going to kind of do my best to read it to you and describe what we're seeing here. We'll kind of see what happens. So on the front here, we got a superhero. Looks like he's punching something, and it says, "The sleeping giant awakens." And then the first panel says, "On the island of Pacifica, Brooks Yamashiro and his best friend Ryoshi Mori are exploring a remote beach when they hear the plaintive cry of a trapped animal." And then one of the kids says, "These strange glowing crystals radiating energy. Stay outside, Ryoshi." And then the other kid outside, "There you are, but I can't quite reach you." Suddenly, Brooks can reach the cat by growing twice his own size. But how? There's no time to solve the riddle. And they grow large, and they're bigger than the cat. And the cave collapses behind our heroes, burying the crystal forever. The strange power of the crystal stays with Brooks in the years to come. And we see him walking down the street, and he's huge. "You don't need a horse and cart when I'm around, Mr. Ito." Letting him grow as big and strong as the job requires. "Thank you, Brooks." And he's doing something to a house. "Just need to yawn and take a nap now." And he's lying down. Life on Pacifica is peaceful until a ship of desperate refugees arrives. And we see a ship with a bunch of people on it. "Help! Our island has been attacked." "By who?" "An evil dictator named Commander Blitzkrieg. He can zap things like an electric eel, and he has an army of killer robots. We were lucky to escape, but more of our people are still under his rule." And we see this evil guy with a bunch of robots and tanks. "The people of Pacifica make new homes for the brave refugees of their island." And we see Brooks still lying down. "Hey, Brooks, wake up! We need to help these people." "Huh? We did? Didn't we? I mean, go and fight this Blitzkrieg guy, you and me." "Fight? Me? How?" "Are you kidding? You could become a giant. You're a one-man arsenal." And then we see a little girl sitting on the ground petting a kitten. "I had to leave my kitty behind when I ran away. I hope I get to see her again someday." "You're right. We have to try." "Great, and I know just how we'll get there." "We'll walk." And it looks like they are walking through the ocean. "Your reign of terror is about to end, Blitzkrieg." "Try and stop me, giant." "Kill them, my robots." And we see a bunch of robots trying to kill him. "Just another beautiful day in paradise," he says as he's smashing robots and planes, etc. And the evil guy's there. "I see my robot tanks and planes are no match for you. But what about my giant warbot?" And we see this huge robot. "Holy cats, that's big. Ryoshi, getting bigger makes me sleepier, and I'm already exhausted." "You can do it, Brooks." And he starts fighting the robot. Yes. With a mighty punch, Brooks smashes the robot. Ah! But loses track of Commander Blitzkrieg. "Ryoshi, no!" And it looks like Ryoshi may be dead. "That will teach you to cross me, giant. Now, if one big warbot can't kill you, how about 100 small warbots? 1,000? 1,000,000? "No. So tired. Can't shake them off." And it looks like they're jumping on top of him and he falls down. All hope of victory is lost until the Pacificans and their friends arrive to join the fight. And then there's a whole bunch of people fighting. And then he's trying to get someone to help Ryoshi. He says, "Please help my friend." And then he sees the bad guy flying away. "Oh, no, you don't." Brooks Yamashiro grows bigger, bigger, bigger than he has ever grown before. And sayonara, Blitzkrieg. And it looks like he punches the evil guy that's trying to fly away. And it looks like they won the battle. With Commander Blitzkrieg and his minions driven out, the island's grateful inhabitants are liberated. "Ryoshi, you're all right." And we see Ryoshi, and he seems to be okay. "Thanks to you. Is Blitzkrieg done?" "I doubt it. We hit him hard, but we've got more work to do." after we both take a little nap. There are more colossal clashes to come, but for today, Brooks Yamashiro has won the battle and earned the nickname the Arsenal of Democracy. Look for more adventures of the Arsenal of Democracy coming soon. And then the last page says, about the creators. Author Frank McCoy was a Navy brat, growing up wherever his Navy pilot father happened to be stationed. After the Second World War, Frank and his family settled on the West Coast, where he graduated from the University of Southern California with a degree in creative writing. Until now, his biggest claim to fame was being the brother of Ginny McCoy, star shortstop for the Kenosha Comets of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. The Arsenal of Democracy is his first published comic book. And then it says, illustrator Stanley Summers was born and raised in Hawaii. After taking time off to serve in the Korean War, Stanley graduated from the University of Hawaii at Manoa with a Master of Fine Arts in Illustration. As a commercial illustrator, his clients have included Levi Strauss & Company, Pan American World Airways, and Scholastic. He and his best friend Frank McCoy co-created the Arsenal of Democracy as boys, writing and drawing his many adventures by mail until they were reunited as adults. Like Frank, this is Stanley's first published comic book. So that is the end of the main part of the book, and what a cool way to end it. I might add the fact that they wrote this comic book together as adults, awesome. But there's a little bit more to come, and it's not related directly to the main story, but this book, of course, is historical fiction. So these are fictional characters, but what they go through is based on historical events, everything in Pearl Harbor. And this part right here, the author explains the history behind it, like what actually happened on that day, the parts that the characters went through, some of which is based on actual things that real-life people went through. Some of it was changed just a tiny little bit to kind of fit the story. But it kind of goes over all that stuff, and it's really interesting, so hopefully you'll stick around for that. Here we go. Author's note. Before Imperial Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, Americans were fiercely divided on how or even if the United States should be involved in World War II, which had begun in 1939. Many remembered with anger and regret how hundreds of thousands of American soldiers had been wounded and killed in World War I, which had ended just 2 decades earlier and seemed to accomplish very little. Isolationists like aviator Charles Lindbergh argued that the United States should remain neutral and let the foreign powers fight among themselves. Interventionists believed that Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan would inevitably threaten American interests and wanted the United States to provide desperately needed assistance to their allies. The debate was contentious. American Jews were well aware that Nazi Germany was openly attacking, robbing, and imprisoning European Jews, but many were afraid to speak up due to widespread anti-Jewish sentiment in America. When Jewish American comic book creators Jack Kirby and Joe Simon drew their new superhero, Captain America, punching out Adolf Hitler and fighting Nazis month after month on the covers of their comic books, the creators got stacks of threatening letters and hate mail. When menacing mobs started hanging out in the street near Timely Comics, the publisher of Captain America, New York City Mayor Fiero LaGuardia had to post police at the company's door for the comic creators' protection. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who generally sided with the interventionists, had to settle for sending ships, planes, tanks, and food to the Allied countries, including England, Russia, France, and China. Calling America the Arsenal of Democracy, Roosevelt encouraged American factories to shift their focuses to war production. All the new jobs created by more manufacturing made U.S. involvement in the war more popular, but many people were still against sending American men and women overseas to join the war effort. All that changed when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. By the summer of 1941, the growing Japanese Empire had taken over large parts of China and was threatening America, British, and French territories in the Pacific and the Far East. The United States and England used economic pressure to try to get Japan to stop, which led to Imperial Japan forming a pact with the Axis powers, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, for trade and defense. When President Roosevelt sent the U.S. Pacific Fleet to Hawaii as a show of force, Japanese leaders took the move as a threat and began planning a preemptive strike of their own. Early on the morning of Sunday, December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor with more than 350 planes and launched from 6 aircraft carriers. wave after wave of Japanese Zeros shot up American airplanes parked on the runways at Ford Island Naval Air Station, Wheeler Field, Hickam Field, and Kanoa Naval Air Station. Japanese torpedo bombers and dive bombers targeted American ships all around the harbor, focusing their attacks on big ships parked on Battleship Row and under repair at the U.S. naval shipyards. The sneak attack came as a total surprise to American sailors, many of whom were still asleep or enjoying a day off. U.S. ships and planes were eventually able to return fire, but did little damage to the Japanese force. The attack on Pearl Harbor lasted just under 2 hours, which seemed like an eternity for the American service members and civilians who survived it. By the time the battle was over, the Japanese had sunk, damaged, or destroyed 20 American ships and wrecked or damaged nearly 350 American planes. Over 2,400 U.S. soldiers and Marines and sailors died in the attack. More than half of them crewmen who were killed when the USS Arizona exploded, and another 1,177 Americans were injured. The Imperial Japanese Navy, meanwhile, lost only 29 planes, 5 submarines, and 64 men. As a result of friendly fire, shots accidentally fired at someone by their own side, the U.S. Navy killed more American civilians during the battle than enemy airmen and sailors, many from shells that overshot their targets and landed in downtown Honolulu. The Imperial Japanese Navy never intended to invade, as many people in Hawaii feared. Instead, the attack was meant to be a knockout blow that would keep the United States out of the war in the Pacific for many years. But that's not what happened. Thanks to the surprise attack, nearly all Americans, even those who had opposed the foreign war, were united in calling for revenge. The United States Congress declared war on Japan the next day with almost unanimous approval. Germany and Italy declared war on the United States soon afterward, and the debate was over. America was now officially in World War II. The United States immediately began fighting Germany at sea in the Atlantic, on the ground in northern Africa, and in the skies over Europe. In the Pacific, the U.S. struck back at Japan with bombers, but struggled to keep up with Japan's naval advances due to the damage done to the fleet at Pearl Harbor. The United States was forced to lean on its surviving aircraft carriers and fighter planes, which turned out to be a blessing in disguise. The new naval fighting techniques the U.S. developed were so effective that by June of 1942, just 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. was able to score a devastating and decisive victory at the Battle of Midway that changed the course of the war against Japan. Back home, meanwhile, the arsenal of democracy went into overdrive. The year after Pearl Harbor, the United States produced an astonishing 47,836 airplanes, a number that would double by 1944. Practically every non-essential American industry turned its factories over to war production. At a Ford plant that once produced cars, a new bomber came off the assembly line every 63 minutes. General Motors made tanks and guns. Even the Lionel Toy Train Company got involved, making compasses for battleships. All that production revitalized the Allied war effort. In 1944, the United States and its allies invaded Nazi-occupied France at Normandy, an event known as D-Day, ultimately helping bring about Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945. A few months after the end of the war in Europe, the United States dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, becoming the first, and as yet only, nation in the world to use nuclear weapons in war. Japanese surrendered a week later, marking the end of the war in the Pacific and the end of World War II. Admiral Hara Tadashi of the Imperial Japanese Navy later said of the surprise attack on Hawaii, "We won a great tactical victory at Pearl Harbor, and thereby lost the war." He and others the world over knew that a sleeping giant had awakened. About the story. Pearl Harbor experts will note that certain historical events happened at slightly different times in my story than they did in real life. Contemporary accounts of the battle say the USS Utah capsized at roughly the same time that the US Arizona exploded, if not a couple of minutes later. There would certainly not be enough time for Frank and Stanley to realistically swim from the USS Utah to Ford Island, cross the Naval Air Station, and be at home in time for the explosion of the Arizona. The fact that both significant events occurred more or less simultaneously speaks to how much was happening all over Pearl Harbor, and I took a little artistic license here and there to allow readers to see as many of those real-life incidents as possible. The black sailors Frank sees helping fight back on both the Utah and the Raleigh are inspired by the real-life story of Doris Miller, a black man who served as a cook on the USS West Virginia. After carrying his ship's wounded captain to safety, Miller manned one of the ship's anti-aircraft guns, which he'd never fired before, and shot down 2 enemy planes. He later saved the lives of most of his fellow sailors before abandoning ship with the rest of the crew as the West Virginia sank to the harbor floor. For his heroism that day, Doris Miller earned the first Navy Cross ever presented to a black sailor. Very few American pilots were able to get planes in the air to fight back like Frank's father did. Only 8 American pilots took to the skies during the battle, and of those, only 6 were officially credited with shooting down Japanese aircraft. Famously, 2 pilots named George Welsh and Kenneth Taylor were coming home from an all-night poker game at the Wheeler Officers Club on base when the attack began. The 2 raced to Hawaii Field, where they convinced the ground crew to prep 2 P-40 Warhawks rather than hide them away as ordered. Taking off and landing twice during the battle to refuel and reload ammunition, the 2 pilots are thought to have shot down at least 7 enemy planes at Pearl Harbor, 1/4 of all Japanese losses. For their actions on December 7th, Taylor and Welsh were named the first 2 American heroes of World War II by the U.S. War Department. The vicious surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, combined with pre-existing and long-standing racism against Asians and Pacific Islanders, sparked a wave of anti-Japanese sentiment across the United States during World War II and beyond. Many Japanese Americans who had proudly displayed photos and heirlooms of their Japanese heritage, like Stanley's family, hurried to literally bury their keepsakes for fear of anti-Japanese backlash. In Hawaii, some Japanese Americans were so afraid that they risked burying their family treasures during the attack, just like Stanley's mom. U.S. counterintelligence agencies, politicians, and regular citizens alike believed, without any proof whatsoever, that any and every Japanese American could be spying for Imperial Japan. On the West Coast and in Hawaii, local authorities immediately began to restrict the rights of Japanese Americans. Then, in February of 1942, just 2 months after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt issued an executive order stripping all Americans of Japanese ancestry of their civil rights. Despite never being charged with a crime, 120,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom had been born in the United States, were forcibly removed from their homes and communities and imprisoned in concentration camps in California, Arizona, Colorado, Idaho, and Utah. In the process, the U.S. government took Japanese Americans' homes, businesses, property, savings, and perhaps most importantly, their liberty. Notably, the U.S. government did not take such extreme measures against German Americans or Italian Americans. During the 4 years the United States was at war, only 10 people were ever convicted for spying for Japan, and all of them were white people of European descent. Not until almost 50 years later, in 1988, did the U.S. government officially apologize and offer modest compensation to the people who had been imprisoned in the camps. Today, the United States and Japan are staunch allies, and more than 1.5 million people of Japanese ancestry call America home. Asian Americans in comics. Stanley's concern over how a Japanese American superhero would be received in the United States in 1941 was a realistic one, as almost every superhero of the 1930s and 1940s was white. The first Asian superhero in mainstream American comics might be a Chinese-American character named Wing, who was introduced in 1938 as a sidekick and personal valet to a masked white superhero called Crimson Avenger. They both appeared in Detective Comics number 20, 7 issues before the character of Batman would first appear in the same comic book series. Early versions of Wing were unfortunately not flattering, depicting him with the same buck teeth, broken English, and inhuman appearance as the Chinese villains in the same comics. American cartoonist Gene Luen Yang and others have made the case for the Green Turtle as the first Asian American superhero, as he was the first to headline his own comic book. In 1944, Hawaiian-born artist Xu F. Heng, who was an American of Chinese ancestry, created the masked superhero of the Green Turtle, who flew around mainland Asia protecting the local citizens from the invading Imperial Japanese Army. Heng wanted his new superhero to be Asian American, but his publishers said no. So Heng just never showed the Green Turtle's face. Every time the Green Turtle took off his mask, he was either turned around backward or his face was conveniently hidden from the reader by a piece of furniture. That way, the Green Turtle could be Asian American. There was no way to say for sure. While the discussion about who the first Asian American superhero really was continues, one fact remains: there have been far too few. The legacy of Pearl Harbor. Japan officially surrendered to United States General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester W. Nimitz on board the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay in 1945. Now a museum ship, the USS Missouri is part of the Pearl Harbor National Memorial and is anchored just behind the sunken wreck of the USS Arizona, which is a grave for 1,102 sailors and Marines killed on that ship during the attack. Nearby is a plaque with a poem Eleanor Roosevelt famously carried with her all during the war, quoted here in Heroes. Together, the Arizona and Missouri are fitting bookends to America's involvement in World War II, which began on that infamous day in 1941. In the same way that comic book superheroes have origin stories, the attack on Pearl Harbor and the American response to it can be seen as the origin story for the United States we know today. It took a punch in the face to drag America into the fight, but from the forge of World War II, the United States emerged as an undisputed global superpower. In the decades that followed, the United States got involved with conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Lebanon, Cuba, Cambodia, Libya, Panama, Iraq, Somalia, Bosnia, Haiti, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Yemen, Pakistan, Uganda, Niger, and Syria, to name just a few. Like Frank and the comic book character he and Stanley created together, what the United States has done with that newfound strength, and what we continue to do, now and in the future, will decide if we are heroes. Alan Gratz, Asheville, North Carolina, USA, 2024. And that is the end of the book. Thank you all for sticking around. I hope you enjoyed it. See you all next time. Bye-bye.